Can the U.S. handle the Syrian crisis all by itself? The countdown now begins to Week 1 and RG3's debut, and always breaking news as it happens. Photos, video, and more right now at WMAL.com.
All right, welcome back, folks. Dan Bongino at DBongino on Twitter. If you want to ask me a question, you can follow MAL at WMAL News, and you can tweet us a question. I will look at it. I read my own Twitter feed. I do my own stunts on Twitter, as Jackie Chan would say. I don't think he said that about Twitter, but you get my point. So we've been talking Syria since 3 o'clock. I'll be here till 7, and we have been hitting it from every angle. We've had great guests, Bill Kristol, KT McFarland, Mario Mancuso. We have Jim CARAFANO coming up. We just had Representative Louis Gohmert from Texas, and we've been hearing it all. But before we have James CARAFANO on, he has a piece at FoxNews.com. 5 leadership lessons on Syria and military power for Commander-in-Chief Obama. Tremendous piece, and folks, I strongly encourage you to take a look at it on FoxNews.com. It's really a great piece. So I think we have Mr. CARAFANO on the line now. Thank you for joining us, sir. Appreciate it.
Hey, it's amazing what you can do on an iPhone.
It's incredible. I mean, again, your phone is probably ringing off the hook. I know with the Secret Service stories, remember they broke, like the White House tours. We went through 3 or 4 phones, so I can imagine any national security incident that your phone probably trains down pretty quickly.
You know, and it's amazing because not only the president's thing, but, you know, they just announced there was an aborted terrorist attack on a container ship in Egypt, and that's huge. I mean, to start seeing terrorist attacks in Egypt, which we were all afraid that, you know, Al-Qaeda was coming. That's maybe even bigger news than our wacky president.
Yeah, oh, and you can follow James CARAFANO on Twitter at JJCARAFANO with a C. And by the way, you do have a great line on your Twitter account, trying to prevent World War III 1 tweet at a time. That's very telling. So I'm
hard work.
It is. You ain't kidding that, but you're doing a good job. So I'm reading your piece here in the break, 5 leadership lessons on Syria. On FoxNews.com. And the first one, I just like to dig into this a bit. Surprise is still a principle of war. Explain for us, our listeners. They think they'd love to hear this.
So when we were cadet at West Point, the first thing they do, and they sit you down and they explain to you kind of War 101, which is these kind of mundane principles of war. One of them, Sun Tzu, wrote about thousands of years ago. It's like, dude, don't tell your enemy what you're doing. It's like a fighter who'd be in a ring and saying, okay, next thing, a left hook's coming at you. So the president has basically given Assad so much time now to really prep for this attack that it really, in a sense, undermines the value of it being a real punitive strike. Because in a sense, you know, they know what their kind of targets they're going to be looking at. They can disperse them. They can have human shields. They're lining up their support. They're hiding evidence. They're doing everything. And then they're basically, when it's all said and done, it's likely they'll have had weeks to do for this. So in a sense, to really kind of punish the regime, to make it really feel the pain, these attacks don't do that. So they really do become simply symbolic attacks to just make President Obama feel good.
We're talking to Jim CARAFANO from Heritage, who has a great piece on FoxNews.com. 5 leadership lessons on Syria and military power for Commander-in-Chief Obama. So lesson 1 was surprise is still a principle of war, and I think you eloquently laid that out. Lesson 2, red lines only work when they are red. I should say when they are actually red. I'm adding actually in there.
Right.
It seems obvious, right?
So, yeah, I mean, here's the deal. If you're going to threaten somebody that you're going to punish them if they do something, if you know, just like raising a child, if you don't immediately turn around and punish them, it doesn't have any value. So, you know, the president's stated for 5 years in his presidency now, having Iran get a nuclear weapon is intolerable. So what happens when Iran gets a nuclear weapon? Is the president going to go to Congress and say, okay, now would you authorize this? Look, the president should go to Congress. I don't want to belittle that. It's absolutely, when there's time, the president should consult the body that represents the American people about how he plans on using their military. But having said that, if the president really cared about being president, he would have been running around for weeks and months, lining up support for his Syria policy, building a coalition, building ally, briefing members. And instead what he's done is put out a stupid red line, which was all stupid when we said it. Now his credibility's on the line, so it's basically, well, if you don't vote for this, you're undermining my credibility. Well, what does that tell the president? So the next time he wants to do something really stupid, he should say it first, and then Congress basically has to, authorize it. I mean, didn't we learn any kind of lesson from Obamacare?
Right. We're talking to Jim Carafano from Heritage. You can follow him on Twitter at JJ Carafano. Interesting that this isn't a new problem in Syria either. And we just had Representative Louis Gohmert on the line. Where was he? Does he have some kind of allergy to the Capitol building? I mean, he never goes over there to sell anything. He ran roughshod over everyone with Obamacare. All of his foreign policy decisions seem to happen in a vacuum. And now all of a sudden he's the great decider, but he doesn't decide. He punts the football to Congress while they're not in session and won't be back till September 9th. So I don't know. I don't get it. Like, I'm lost. Do we even have a coherent foreign policy anymore?
Well, that's easy. No. Look, the whole moral outrage thing, I mean, that just is a head scratcher. So 100,000 people die in this war, and there's no sense of moral outrage. But a couple hundred people get gassed. And don't get me wrong. I mean, sarin gas is a horrible way to die.
Course, right, but...
And anybody that did that, I mean, they're one step to the right of Adolf Hitler, and they ought to be, strung up somewhere. But it just, the whole thing just so smacks of, I don't want to say amateur hour because that makes amateurs look bad.
Right. We're talking to Jim Carafano. We're talking about his piece in FoxNews.com, 5 leadership lessons on Syria. So we got through 1 and 2. Lesson 3, a shot across the bow only works if the enemy thinks you're serious about actually sinking their ship. Explain, please. So
the Coast Guard does this all the time. They're chasing somebody, and what they do is they literally put a shot across the bow. Usually it's not a cannon, it's a machine gun. It's like, dude, if you don't stop, the next shot's going into the ship, and the ship stops. So the president's already come out and said, look, this isn't about changing the balance of power in the Civil War, regime changes, or anything else. So basically, he's telling everybody it's just a meaningless symbolic act.
Right, he's already limited his. He said it's going to be a limited strike. It just seems to me that, let's see, how did the focus group respond to this? They like the word limited. Okay, let's stick limited in there. Sir, there may be consequences to you saying that publicly. I disregard it, polls well. I mean, it really, to me, is disturbing. But let's get to lesson 4 here. We're talking to Jim Carafano about his article on FoxNews.com today. Check it out. It's terrific. Jim Carafano from Heritage. Lesson 4. Victory has 1,000 fathers, defeats an orphan. You're absolutely right. Explain, please.
So, so the president's like, well, this is looking really bad, so I need better poll numbers and everything else. Well, that's not a substitute for actually having a real strategy. People forget George Bush had a UN resolution, had an authorization of force from Congress, the wide public support, and a massive coalition. But when the wars got ugly, people just ran away right and left and blamed him. So if somehow Obama thinks if Congress does greenlight his strategy, and here's a problem, he doesn't have a strategy. We're not going to get a good practical outcome here. When things go horribly wrong, it's going to say, well, it's not my fault because Congress voted for this. That ain't going to work.
We're talking to Jim Carafano. You can follow him on Twitter at JJ Carafano, Carafano. Lesson 5, I think, in your article on FoxNews.com, it segues nicely. Mr. President, think before you act. He doesn't seem to do that. He seems to say, talk, and then do, and then after the fact, they have to retroactively go and say, well, we didn't exactly say that. I mean, really, explain, please, lesson 5, think before you act.
So I'm sure the president thinks that this is brilliant domestic politics. So here's the history of this. He puts out a red line that he put out because he really believed he'd never have to enforce it. Right. And nobody would give him a hard time over doing this. Then all of a sudden, the thing becomes just a disaster. The Allies jump right and left. The UN won't even confirm that the Assad regime is responsible. It doesn't poll well. I mean, everything's going against him. So what does the president do? He comes up with this brilliant idea. He says, I'll just dump this awful mess on the Congress. And how can I lose? If they say no, I can appear the moral leader who earned his Nobel Peace Prize because I had empathy with the international community and by God I wanted to do it. If they say yes to his ridiculously stupid plan and things go horribly wrong, he could say, oh, but we're all in this together. Right. So domestically it sounds wonderful, but from an international perspective, from the perspective of being a world leader, this just looks ridiculous.
Yeah, and he will. He has a Ph.D. in passing the buck. He's absolutely amazing at it. If there's one skill he has, passing the buck, he is absolutely spectacular. Before I let you go here, and thank you for taking the time, one final question I was asking Rep. Gohmert and KT McFarland. Congress not in session and war fatigue setting in all over the country amongst Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Occupy Wall Street people. How do you think this plays out in Congress? I gotta imagine right now Speaker Boehner's not too happy about this football being put in his lap.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And look, I work at a nonpartisan foundation. I'm not even a Republican. I'm a independent voter. And the West Wing, it doesn't matter if it's run by the left wing or the right wing. They should be doing the right thing and stuff.
Right.
So this is just kind of a cold, detached assessment. My guess is it'll get by in the Senate. That Reid will line up most of the Democrats, and there'll be some Republicans that have been pushing for this that look at the Senate. The House, I think that's a toss-up because it only gets by in the House if the leadership of the House really puts the screws to people who have had some real issues with this administration. I'm not sure it happens, but here's the deal. And we just put a post on on the Foundry in our blog by our analyst Jim Phillips, who's tremendously excellent. And we said, look, here's kind of the 10, a whole bunch of things that the president's going to have to do to make the case that this really makes sense. And it's a hard to-do list for these guys. So I don't know if it gets through the House.
An interesting perspective. I would actually be surprised if it gets through the Senate as well. But listen, you've dug into this policy pretty deep. I really value your perspective. Thank you so much for coming on. We're talking to Jim Carafano. Thank you, sir. Really do appreciate the time. All right, folks, that was Jim Carafano. Listen, I don't know. I'm just not sure it's going to get through the Senate either. But the House is always a bit more responsive. 2-year election cycles, gerrymandering, having to pander to a base. So again, thanks to Jim Carafano for coming on, and give him a follow on Twitter at JJ Carafano. All right, folks, we got more coming up. Let's see, we got tons of guests. Let me look at my handy dandy phone here. Captain Chuck Nash. All right, at 6:05. That should be a great interview. And stay on the line. 888-630-9625. Nate, Chris, Gary, Kelly, phone lines are stacked up. We will get to you right after the break. I'm Dan Bongino. Stay tuned.